Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
Chapter 1, A Death at the Fair. The winter fair at Harrington Cross had the agreeable bustle of a well-kept hive. Stalls of hot chestnuts and barley sugar lined the square. The maypole, borrowed shamelessly from summer, had been wound with blue and white ribbon for effect, and the church bells, attempting restraint, gave a discreet chime on the hour. We had stopped only because the express to London had chosen to develop an unscheduled sulk somewhere beyond Bridgenorth, and the station master, full of apologies and local pride, assured us we should be better entertained in the square than shivering upon his platform. Allan Pinkerton surveyed the scene with that quiet appreciation he gives to anything well arranged. He was never indifferent to order. Even a fair, if clean and honest, pleased him. We were taking coffee at a trestle set outside the King's Harp, an old coaching in whose signboard, creaking amiably, displayed a gilded instrument half lost in weather and time, when a ripple passed through the crowd. It is a curious thing, that change in a multitude when news touches it, laughter thins, movement firms, and faces turn as if a draught had entered the room. The innkeeper came out at a trot, wiping his hands. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, Sergeant Bligh has asked for any doctor or man of experience to come at once. It's the magistrate. Found in his study. They say," he faltered, the relish of tidings checked by respect. "They say he shot himself." Pinkerton put down his cup. "Where?" "3 doors along, Kellaway House. The study looks onto the lane." He peered at Pinkerton more closely. "You've an air about you, sir, if you'll forgive me. Not a doctor, no, but a man as might be of use." Pinkerton rose at once. "We will come, Mr. Dacre," said the innkeeper, already turning to lead. "Henry Dacre. This way, sir." We crossed the square at a brisk pace, the cold catching at one's throat and the thin sunlight glancing off frosted panes. Kellaway House stood respectable and square in brick darkened by years of rain, its brass knocker polished to an anxious gleam. The door was ajar. Within, the little hall was crowded, a stout woman in a shawl, the cook, a parlour-maid with red eyes, and Sergeant Bligh, a thick-set man of conscientious aspect, hat in hand. "Sergeant Bligh," said Dacre, "this gentleman." "Bligh," Pinkerton said mildly, "my name will not assist you, my eyes may. May I see the room before anyone else remembers something?" Bligh hesitated only a moment, then stood aside. "Aye. Best be quick, sir. The widow's upstairs with the vicar. I've kept folk out." The study lay at the back, a narrow room with 2 tall bookcases, a plain desk under the window, and a coal grate where the last of a fire had fallen to dull embers. There was a smell that made one's skin contract, the raw, sharp tang of spent powder, together with something less domestic, a Swedish tobacco that did not belong to English blends. Magistrate Horace Kellaway sat in the high-backed chair by the desk as if he had merely dozed and dreamed badly. His head had fallen to one side, in his right hand, loosely, a small pistol rested against his knee. The right temple bore the ugly truth. A dark stain had fallen upon the shoulder of his frock coat and spread in a slow map down the lapel. Pinkerton stood just inside the door and did not move for several seconds. No one touched anything. No, sir, said Bligh. I've the key as was in his pocket. Found the door locked on the inside, we had to force it with the locksmith's bar. Windows fastened, too. Pinkerton inclined his head and crossed to the desk. He did not reach for the weapon, he looked at it. A tidy man, he observed. The pen wiped, the blotter square, the calendar still set to yesterday. He stooped to the carpet. Sergeant, would you be so kind as to crouch where I am and sniff? Here. Bligh, who was no fool, did as asked. Tobacco, he said after a moment, surprised. But not pipe. A queer sort. Cigar, said Pinkerton. Imported, and not common in Shropshire. He glanced at the dead man's hands, the left stained faintly with ink along the edge, the right dusted with a dark bloom. Powder pattern on the right glove, he murmured. Yet no black on the thumb. His eyes went to the pistol again. And the muzzle, see the ring of soot. Closed discharge, but the burning of hair is slight. Odd. He went to the window. The latch was down hard, the inner face of the pane showed the greasy half-moon where a forehead had leaned in other days to look out. Who discovered him? The clerk, Bligh answered. Mr. Elmsley. He came just after the noon bell to fetch papers for the fair licenses. The door was locked. He fetched me from the square. Where is Mr. Elmsley now? In the parlour, sir. Proper cut up. Good. We will speak with him shortly. Pinkerton's gaze drifted to the grate. He took the poker and, with the lightest of touches, shifted the upper crust of ash. Someone burned a small quantity of paper recently, he said. See how the ash makes thin flakes. Different from coal. And, ah. He paused. Not now. Bligh's head came up. Not now, what? Pinkerton's smile flickered. A curiosity for later. He straightened and faced the sergeant squarely. Tell me what you know of the circumstances. We were shown upstairs. Mrs. Kellaway sat in a small chamber overlooking the square, where the fair went heedlessly on, as fairs must. She was not young, nor fashionably sorrowful. Hers was the grief of a woman who has managed everything for years and does not quite know where to put her hands when there is nothing to manage. The vicar, a thin, anxious man, rose and made way. Pinkerton bowed with grave simplicity. Madam, I am sorry to trouble you. I will not speak of your loss. I will ask only what may spare you further pain. She looked at him with gratitude. Ask, sir. Your husband, was he despondent? No, she spoke without hesitation. He was worried. The Middenland case weighs upon us all, there's bad feeling. But he was not a man to. She stopped, pressed her handkerchief to her lips, and mastered herself. No. Did he smoke cigars? Never, she said with a flash of indignation. He said the smell was vulgar, and a kind of bewildered offense crossed her face. Sir, did you smell? I did. It is of no importance yet, Pinkerton said calmly. One more thing. Who has the habit of coming to the study unannounced? Only Mr. Elmsley, she said. And my nephew, Edwin. He is staying with us while his mother is ill. But he is a good boy. Pinkerton's eyes warmed. Good boys are to be encouraged. Thank you, madam. You have helped more than you know. Back downstairs, we found Mr. Elmsley in the parlour. A narrow fellow in a clean collar, with the inkstains of his office worn like a badge. His fingers worried the brim of his hat. He told his tale without ornament, though twice his eyes slid toward the shuttered window as if something outside might contradict him. He had, he said, called at noon, knocked, called again, waited, and then fetched Sergeant Bligh. He had no key, of course. The magistrate kept the study private, as was proper. "Did anyone pass you in the lane on your way to fetch the sergeant?" Pinkerton asked. Elmsley blinked. "Aye. A gentleman in a dark coat. Stranger to me. He had a cigar in his mouth." He seemed surprised by his own recall. Pinkerton's expression did not alter. "Thank you." When we returned to the study, Pinkerton closed the door and let his gaze travel once more about the room. "A locked door, a key in the dead man's pocket, a fastened window," he said gently. "We are asked to accept what is simplest. I am a stubborn pupil." He went to the grate again. With a folded handkerchief around his fingers, he lifted the upper ash, turned it once, and revealed, just for a second, what had glinted there before, a soft, distorted crescent of dull metal, no larger than a fingernail. He did not touch it. He let the ash fall back and smoothed it with the poker until nothing was visible but grey. "Sergeant," he said, "you will oblige me by putting a constable at this door and another at the lane window. No one is to enter. No one is to smoke in this house. We will visit the tobacconist, if the county possesses one worth the name, and we will speak to Mr. Dacre again about strangers with a taste for the foreign." Bligh nodded. "You think someone staged it, sir?" Pinkerton took up his hat. "I think a man who meant to die would not be so tidy as to wipe his pen and square his blotter and leave his lamp turned low, yet forget to hide the scent of a cigar he never smoked. Come, my friend," he added to me, and for the first time that day there was the smallest edge of eagerness in his voice. "There is always a place where the false story frays. In Harrington Cross, I fancy the first loose thread lies in ash." Chapter 2, The Locked Study. The late afternoon light was fading to a pewter grey when Pinkerton followed Constable Merrick back to the magistrate's residence. The fair beyond the square had not ceased entirely, muffled laughter and the faint jangle of a barrel organ floated on the crisp air, but the atmosphere was subdued, as though the merriment were taking place behind a drawn curtain. The house of Horace Kellaway stood in dignified repose at the corner of a cobbled lane, its mullioned windows catching the last gleam of day. Pinkerton noted the faint crunch of gravel underfoot as he approached, storing the detail away. Gravel retained impressions, useful ones. Merrick produced a heavy brass key from his pocket and unlocked the door. They stepped into a hall paneled in dark oak, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and something else, faint, elusive, tobacco smoke, but not the sharp Virginia favored in England. This was mellower, more exotic. Pinkerton let his gaze wander upward to the broad staircase, then followed Merrick toward the study. "It was locked from the inside when we found him," the constable explained. "Windows latched, shutters drawn. Took the better part of half an hour to get in, as Mrs. Kellaway insisted we wait for her permission. We had to send for the carpenter to force the lock. Only when the door gave did we find the key, in the poor man's own pocket." They halted before a stout oak door. Merrick pushed it open, and Pinkerton stepped into a room that seemed more shadow than substance. The single gas lamp on the desk cast a circle of light upon green baize, illuminating papers neatly stacked, an open ledger, and a half-empty decanter of port. In the high-backed leather chair sat Horace Kellaway, head bowed slightly to one side, the revolver resting in his right hand. To a casual eye, the scene was tragically self-explanatory. But Pinkerton had no casual eye. He moved slowly, observing before he touched. The pistol, for one thing, was held loosely, with the index finger barely curled around the guard. The powder burns along the temple were faint, far less than one would expect at such close range. And, most telling, there was no trace of stippling along the skin. "I presume," said Pinkerton, his voice quiet, "the revolver has been examined." Merrick nodded. 2 chambers fired. One round lodged in the wall, likely from the shot that drew Mrs. Kellaway's attention, the other, well, the one that killed him. Pinkerton said nothing at first, only leaned slightly to catch the line of the bullet hole behind the desk. It was oddly angled, as though the weapon had been held higher than the deceased's natural seated posture. He made a note of it in the small leather notebook he carried. He next turned his attention to the windows. Heavy curtains of green damask were drawn tight, the brass latches fastened. Pinkerton lifted the corner of one curtain and found the sill cold, unmarked by recent disturbance. The hearth, however, told another story, grey ash still faintly warm, and within it a darker residue, granular, aromatic. "This," murmured Pinkerton, crouching to inspect it, "is not from English tobacco. This is a Havana blend, strong, earthy, and not common here." Merrick frowned. "The magistrate didn't smoke cigars." "Then someone else did," said Pinkerton simply. On the desk, the open ledger appeared routine at first glance, filled with neat columns of figures and terse annotations. But in the margin of one page, Pinkerton found a penciled note, hastily written, the letters jagged, "Friday, meet at the gate, bring papers." No signature, no further elaboration. He folded the scrap discreetly into his notebook. From the dead man's pocket, Merrick produced the key they had found. "Only key to the study, far as we know," the constable remarked. Pinkerton examined it. Worn smooth from years of use, it bore a faint smear of something oily at the bow. Pocket grease? Possibly. But he also noted that the waistcoat into which it had been placed was on the left side, awkward for a right-handed man. Turning, he surveyed the carpet. The pile near the door was faintly compressed in an irregular shape, a boot perhaps, heavier on one side than the other. But no such mark appeared near the chair, as though the person who had stood at the desk had taken care to remain there, not pacing. From the hallway came a light, deliberate footstep. Mrs. Kellaway entered, her face composed in the way of a woman who has wept until there is nothing more to spend. She was dressed in deep mourning, though it had been prepared hastily, the crepe veil hung unevenly. "I understand you are here at the request of Mr. Merrick," she said, her tone formal but not unkind. "If you require anything further, Mr. Pinkerton, madam," he supplied with a courteous bow. "My condolences. I will require little for now, only the assurance that the study remain as it is until I am finished." Her eyes flicked toward the hearth and then back again. "If you wish. Though I do not understand the need. The doctor said it was the strain, he had been unwell for months." "Perhaps," she broke off, her voice trembling. "Perhaps," Pinkerton said gently, "but I prefer to be certain." After she withdrew, Pinkerton made one final circuit of the room. The revolver he left for the constable's armory, but not before noting a faint smear along the barrel, a smudge that might be powder, might be something else entirely. The oil lamp, too, was curious, its wick had been trimmed unevenly, suggesting haste. When at last he stepped back into the hall, Pinkerton closed the doors softly behind him. "Constable," he said, "this was no suicide. The evidence has been arranged. I will require a list of all who attended the fair yesterday and today, and the names of any visitors to the Kellaway house in the past week. And," he added, "the name of every man in Harrington Cross who smokes Havana cigars." Merrick blinked. "That may take some doing, sir." Pinkerton smiled faintly. Then it is fortunate we have the evening ahead of us. A man's life has been taken, Mr. Merrick, and the manner of it is one that demands both precision and subtlety. Whoever killed Magistrate Kellaway wished us to believe in despair and solitude. I, however, believe in human motive, and that is rarely solitary. They left the house as the first flakes of snow began to fall, softening the edges of the square and laying a pale shroud over the cobbles. Pinkerton paused at the gate, glancing down at the gravel path once more. The impressions there would soon be gone, lost beneath the white. But in his mind, they were already fixed, a part of the puzzle that would, in time, reveal the hand that had struck in the locked study. Chapter 3, The Widow and the Nephew. By morning, Harrington Cross lay beneath a thin quilt of snow, the rooftops and hedgerows softened into shades of pearl and grey. The market square, usually brisk with chatter by dawn, was subdued. People spoke in low voices, their eyes turning toward the Kellaway residence as though the house itself might overhear. Pinkerton had arranged to speak with Mrs. Kellaway in her morning room, a place less formal than the study, with pale walls and a bank of frost-traced windows. She received him seated at a small table where a pot of tea steamed gently. "You have questions," she said at once, her tone brisker than the night before. "Only to understand your husband's recent affairs," Pinkerton replied evenly. "I am told he was unwell." Her gaze shifted to the snow beyond the glass. "A persistent cough, a certain tiredness, nothing fatal," the doctor said. "But he did seem burdened. Particularly in the last fortnight." "By what?" She hesitated, then set down her teacup with deliberate care. "He had been receiving letters. They arrived without a return address, the handwriting crude, as though the writer were disguising his hand. Horace burned them almost at once, but I saw one before it went into the fire. It demanded payment. A sum of £100. In exchange, it said, for silence. Silence on what subject? That, she said, meeting his eyes squarely, I do not know. Pinkerton made a note, but he read something in her tone, not quite certainty. Whether she withheld knowledge or genuinely lacked it, he could not yet tell. Before he could press further, a light rap came at the door. Merrick appeared, ushering in a tall young man with the easy grace of one unaccustomed to manual labor. His coat was of fine cloth, but the cuffs showed fraying, his cravat was knotted fashionably, yet worn at the edges. "Mr. Jonathan Kellaway," Merrick announced. "The magistrate's nephew." Jonathan bowed perfunctorily, his eyes sharp with curiosity, and perhaps calculation. "Mrs. Kellaway," he said with a practiced solemnity, "my condolences once again." "And you, sir?" "Pinkerton," came the reply. "I am here to assist in clarifying the circumstances of your uncle's death." Jonathan gave a short, almost dismissive laugh. "Clarify? Surely there is nothing unclear. My uncle was difficult. Rigid. If he decided to end his own life, I cannot say I am surprised. Your uncle's affairs," Pinkerton said lightly, "will, I presume, pass in part to you." Jonathan's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the widow. "A modest bequest, yes. Though far less than the town supposes. My uncle believed in thrift, for himself and for others." "Were you here yesterday?" Pinkerton asked. The young man smiled faintly. "At the fair for most of the day. I returned to my lodgings before dark." Merrick, standing near the door, cleared his throat. "I saw you in the square after dusk, Mr. Kellaway. Near the tobacconist's." Jonathan's smile did not falter, but his hand went to his pocket. "I had business there. A shipment of cigars arrived last week. Havana, if you must know, a rare indulgence. Pinkerton's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And do you smoke them at your lodgings, or elsewhere?" "Wherever I please," the young man replied, the faintest edge in his voice. After Jonathan departed, Mrs. Kellaway's composure wavered. "He is my husband's sister's boy," she said. "Horace took him under his wing years ago, paid for his schooling, found him work in the clerk's office. But Jonathan, he has always wanted more than he was given." When Pinkerton left the house, he turned down the narrow lane beside the tobacconist's. The shop's small window displayed an array of pipes and neatly stacked cigar boxes. Inside, the proprietor, a stooped man with pince-nez perched on his nose, confirmed that Jonathan had indeed purchased a bundle of Havanas the previous evening. "Paid in cash, as always," the man added. But the tobacconist also recalled something else, a second man loitering outside during the transaction. Broad-shouldered, with a dark coat pulled tight against the cold, and a scar across one cheek. He had not entered, but had watched the exchange closely before disappearing into the mist toward the river. Back at the constable's office, Merritt produced the list Pinkerton had requested: fair vendors, recent visitors to the Kellaway house, and, as best as could be managed, known smokers of Havana cigars in Harrington Cross. Jonathan's name was among the latter, but so too were two others of interest: Amos Rigg, a riverboat captain with a reputation for shady dealings, and Dr. Silas Brooke, the town's physician. Pinkerton studied the list in silence, his finger tapping once against the page when it reached Brooke's name. A physician would have the knowledge to arrange a death with precision, and the means to disguise its true cause. Yet before any conclusion could be drawn, there remained the shadow of that scarred man near the tobacconist, a man who might connect the magistrate's locked study with the wider web Pinkerton sensed tightening around Harrington Cross. Snow began to fall again as the investigator closed his notebook. Somewhere in this quiet town lay the thread that, once pulled, would unravel the careful illusion of suicide. And Pinkerton intended to find it. Chapter 4: The Man by the River. The River Wye ran slow and cold that winter morning, its surface sheened with ice along the shaded banks. Pinkerton, collar turned up against the wind, followed the narrow towpath leading away from Harrington Cross toward the trading quay. Here the air was rank with tar and river mud, and the clang of chains carried faintly from the moored barges. Amos Rigg's vessel, the Daring, lay low in the water, her hull scabbed with peeling paint. A man in a thick reefer coat stood on deck, coiling rope with practiced ease. Even from a distance, the line of his shoulders and the sharp tilt of his head suggested wariness. "Captain Rigg?" Pinkerton called, stepping onto the gangplank. The man's eyes narrowed. A faint white scar ran from temple to cheek, distorting his smile when it came. "Who's asking?" "Allan Pinkerton. I'm assisting the authorities in clarifying the death of Magistrate Kellaway." Rigg let the rope drop. "Nothing to do with me." "That may be so," Pinkerton replied mildly. "Though it is curious, a man of your appearance was seen near the tobacconist's the night the magistrate died, watching his nephew buy Havana cigars." Rigg's eyes flickered, just for an instant. "Plenty of men have scars. You going to question them all?" "Only those who loiter outside shops at dusk without making a purchase." Rigg gave a short bark of laughter. "Maybe I was waiting on someone." "Not a crime, last I checked." Pinkerton let the silence stretch. The slap of water against the hull and the distant cry of gulls filled the gap. At last, Rigg said, "Jonathan owed me money. Wager on a shipment that went bad. I was waiting to remind him. That's all." "And did he pay you?" "No. Said he was expecting funds soon. Promised I'd have it by week's end." Rigg's mouth twisted. Now, with the old man gone, maybe he'll have his inheritance and settle up. Pinkerton's gaze sharpened. You are certain he expected to come into money? Certain enough to wait in the cold for him, Rigg replied, then turned back to his rope, the conversation dismissed. Leaving the quay, Pinkerton walked upriver toward the narrow bridge that connected the market quarter to the Physician's Row. The snow had melted here into a slick brown sludge, and children's boot prints crisscrossed the approach. Dr. Silas Brooks' surgery stood at the far end, a neat brick building with whitewashed trim. Inside, the air smelled faintly of camphor and polished wood. Brooke himself emerged from a back room, tall and lean, his spectacles catching the light. Mr. Pinkerton, I presume. Merrick mentioned you might call. A most distressing business. Indeed, Pinkerton said. You attended the magistrate recently? Only last week. A mild bronchial complaint, nothing unusual for a man of his years. And yet he died suddenly. Brooke inclined his head gravely. So it appears. Though without a post-mortem, which the widow has declined, one cannot be certain of cause. Pinkerton studied the man's long fingers, the slight tremor as he adjusted his spectacles. Did the magistrate ever confide in you? Speak of threats, perhaps. Brooke hesitated. Not directly. But he alluded to a mistake in his youth. Something he feared might be exposed. I did not pry. A physician's role is to heal, not interrogate. Nevertheless, knowledge of such a mistake might serve as leverage, Pinkerton observed. The doctor's eyes met his steadily. I am not in the habit of blackmail, Mr. Pinkerton. Nor would I risk my practice over a man's past indiscretion. As Pinkerton stepped back into the cold, he could not help noting that both Rigg and Brooke had, in their different ways, linked Jonathan Kellaway to the promise of money following the magistrate's death. Whether that link was the cause of murder, or merely an unfortunate coincidence, remained to be seen. Crossing the bridge once more, Pinkerton paused midway to watch the river slide beneath. Somewhere along this current of debt, threat, and secrecy lay the truth, and it was gathering speed. Chapter 5, A Letter in the Ashes. The afternoon sky over Harrington Cross had taken on that leaden weight which promised snow by nightfall. Pinkerton, after a brief stop at the local post office to confirm a hunch, made his way to Kellaway House once again. The brass knocker was cold in his hand, and the sound echoed dully in the drafty hallway when Mrs. Lorna Kellaway herself opened the door. Mr. Pinkerton, she said, her voice tight, I do hope you have something of importance to discuss. I have guests arriving. I believe, Pinkerton replied smoothly, that importance lies in the eye of the beholder. Might I trouble you for a few moments in your late husband's study? Her lips pressed into a line, but she stood aside. 5 minutes. The study smelled faintly of tobacco and wood polish. Heavy curtains, drawn halfway, admitted a thin winter light that picked out dust motes in the air. The hearth, however, was tellingly cold, yet in the grate lay a mound of half-burned paper and blackened envelopes. Pinkerton crouched, lifting one charred scrap with his penknife. The ink had run in the heat, but certain words still clung stubbornly to the paper. The arrangement must remain, and, Jonathan cannot. The rest was scorched into illegibility. You've been clearing out? Pinkerton said without looking up. My husband kept too many letters, she replied briskly. Private matters. Best consigned to the fire. Curious, he murmured, turning the scrap over. Private matters that mention your nephew. Her eyes flickered, not quite fear, but a shadow of calculation. Jonathan is family. He was often the subject of my husband's correspondence. Pinkerton dropped the fragment back into the grate and stood. One wonders, madam, why certain letters survive the years only to be destroyed the morning after a sudden death. Her composure thinned. Are you suggesting? I suggest nothing, madam. I observe. He moved toward the desk, noting the empty letter rack and a faint square of paler wood where something, perhaps a box, had stood for years. I will not have this insinuation in my house, she snapped. You have your 5 minutes. Now kindly leave. Pinkerton tipped his hat. Of course. Outside, the cold bit sharper than before. He took the side path past the service door, where a kitchen maid was shaking crumbs from a cloth into the hedge. You've been with the family long? He asked gently. For years, sir, she said, eyes down. Since before Mr. Jonathan came back from London. And you saw the study fire this morning? Yes, sir. Mrs. Kellaway had me fetch more coal. Said she was burning rubbish. Though, she had a letter in her hand she didn't burn. Slipped it into her workbox when she heard someone at the door. Pinkerton's interest sharpened. This workbox, does it leave the house? Oh, aye. She takes it to the sewing circle at St. Mildred's every Thursday. By the time Pinkerton reached the corner, he had stitched the fragments together, an unburned letter, possibly tied to Jonathan, hidden away, a deliberate destruction of other correspondence, and an unwillingness to allow a post-mortem. It was enough to suspect that what had been committed to paper might unravel the whole affair, if only he could get his hands on it. That evening, back in his lodging at the Crown and Chisel, Pinkerton sat with a pot of strong tea and his notebook. In tidy script, he recorded 3 lines. Jonathan's expected inheritance, motive. Riggs' claim of debt, corroboration. Letter hidden in workbox, key to leverage or guilt. The snow began in earnest outside, muffling the sounds of the street. Somewhere in Harrington Cross, a secret was folded between paper and ink, waiting for the right hands to open it. Pinkerton intended those hands to be his. Chapter 6, The Sewing Circle. The snow lay thick on Harrington Cross by Thursday morning, muting the world in a white hush. The streets were near deserted save for the occasional cart creaking under its load of coal or firewood. Pinkerton, wrapped in a dark overcoat and scarf, strolled at an unhurried pace toward St. Mildred's Parish Hall, his polished boots leaving crisp impressions in the fresh powder. He had made careful inquiries the day before, learning that Mrs. Kellaway rarely missed the weekly sewing circle, a gathering of respectable ladies, ostensibly for needlework but, in truth, as much for the exchange of gossip. Today, that gossip might prove particularly fruitful. Inside, the hall smelled of tea, lavender sachets, and the faint bite of wool. A fire crackled at the far end, casting a warm glow over a cluster of tables where half a dozen women sat with sewing baskets open. Pinkerton stepped quietly to the side, removing his hat. Mr. Pinkerton. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Ellaby, greeted him with the mixture of curiosity and social duty common to village hostesses. You'll forgive us for being informal. The ladies are deep in their work. My apologies for intruding, Pinkerton said with a courteous bow. I have been tasked with making a brief announcement regarding parish security, most pressing in this inclement weather. That earned him a polite wave toward the front, where he delivered a few well-chosen sentences about ensuring back doors were bolted and coal sheds locked, the sort of talk that allowed him to scan the room without suspicion. There she was, Mrs. Kellaway, in a dove-gray shawl, seated at the table nearest the fire. Before her sat an open wicker workbox, lined in blue silk. Inside, under a tidy arrangement of reels and folded linen, Pinkerton caught a glimpse of a pale envelope, its corner marked with a distinct dark flourish of ink. When he concluded his security remarks, he moved among the tables, exchanging pleasantries and admiring the handiwork. The ladies, delighted by the attention, offered him glimpses of embroidered cushions and lace edgings. By the time he reached Mrs. Kellaway, she was threading a needle with deliberate poise. "A cold day for errands, Mrs. Kellaway," he said mildly. "I walk briskly," she replied without looking up. "It keeps one warm." His eyes rested a moment longer on the workbox. "And perhaps one's mind equally occupied." She gave him a thin smile. "Some of us prefer useful work to idle talk." "Indeed," Pinkerton murmured. And yet, he leaned just enough to lower his voice. "You carry a letter that might be more profitably discussed in private." Her hand froze. "I've no idea what you mean." "Then you will not mind if we arrange a meeting tomorrow," he said, straightening. "I shall call at 11. Before she could protest, he moved away, leaving her staring down at her needle as if it had turned to a serpent. Later, outside in the snow, Pinkerton reflected that direct confrontation, though risky, had its virtues. By forcing her to guard the letter more closely, he would know exactly where it was, and perhaps draw her into a defensive move that revealed far more than she intended. That afternoon, he posted a discreet note to Jonathan Kellaway, inviting him to the Crown and Chisel for a conversation in confidence. If the young man's conscience was as troubled as Pinkerton suspected, a little well-placed pressure might cause the cracks to widen. In the game that was unfolding, each piece had to be moved with precision. And Pinkerton, ever the patient player, was already 2 moves ahead. Chapter 7, Confessions by the Fire. The Crown and Chisel's private parlor was all oak panels, brass fittings, and the comforting smell of mulled wine. A fire blazed in the grate, its warmth drawing beads of moisture onto the window panes. Allan Pinkerton sat with his back to the fire, hands steepled, his eyes fixed on the door. Jonathan Kellaway arrived a few minutes past the hour, hat in hand, his coat collar turned up against the cold. He looked more worn than Pinkerton remembered, pale, with faint smudges beneath his eyes. "You wanted to see me, sir." Jonathan's tone was guarded, his gaze darting toward the sideboard where the decanter stood. "Yes," Pinkerton replied evenly. "Please, sit. This is no formal interrogation, merely an opportunity to put your mind at rest, if you can." Jonathan lowered himself into the chair opposite. The fire popped, sending a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. "I imagine," Pinkerton continued, "you have heard of my conversation with your aunt at the sewing circle. She did not strike me as a woman eager to volunteer information." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "She means well. She's protective of the family." "A noble trait, under most circumstances," Pinkerton said. "But sometimes protection conceals more than it should. For instance, a letter in her possession. Pale envelope, distinctive flourish of ink. It was not hers." Jonathan's eyes flickered, just enough to confirm Pinkerton's suspicion. "I can't speak to that." "You can," Pinkerton said softly. "And you will, unless you wish your name to be dragged through a very public inquiry." There was a long silence. Outside, the muffled sound of a cart's wheels crunched through snow. Jonathan's hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. "It wasn't meant to go so far," he said at last. I was in debt. Badly. I thought if I could get some leverage on Travers, the man had dealings not entirely clean, I might persuade him to invest in a scheme of mine. But when he refused, I wrote the letter. It was bluff, nothing more. I didn't even send it. I left it with Aunt, asking her to keep it safe. Then Travers died. Pinkerton did not blink. "Bluff, you call it. And yet, your bluff became a threat when Travers was found dead within days of your writing it. Jonathan looked stricken. I swear, I didn't kill him. Pinkerton studied the young man's trembling hands. Perhaps you didn't. But someone, knowing of that letter, could make it appear otherwise. He rose, placing his hat carefully on his head. Jonathan, if you value your freedom, you will see me tomorrow morning at Mrs. Kellaway's, when I return for the letter. Keep yourself sober, and your wits sharp. As Pinkerton stepped into the chill night air, his breath rising in white plumes, he felt the shape of the endgame forming. Mrs. Kellaway held the letter, Jonathan held the guilt, and somewhere in between stood the person who had turned leverage into murder. Tomorrow, the pieces would fall into place. Chapter 8, The Unmasking. The parlor of Mrs. Kellaway's house had been rearranged to accommodate all the principal players in the matter. Chairs were drawn close, a small coal fire hissed gently, and the air was thick with a tension that made every cough sound like a gunshot. Mrs. Kellaway sat stiffly near the mantel, her knitting untouched in her lap. Jonathan Kellaway occupied the seat beside her, pale but composed. Miss Archer, Travers' former secretary, perched at the far end of the sofa, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. Inspector Hall stood by the door, watchful as a sentry. Allan Pinkerton entered last, closing the door quietly behind him. He remained standing, hat and cane set aside, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm but carrying easily over the crackle of the fire, we are gathered because one of you is responsible for the death of Mr. William Travers. And I will tell you now, the truth has been in plain sight from the very beginning. Jonathan's head dropped slightly. If this is about the letter. It is, Pinkerton interrupted, but not in the way you fear. The letter was indeed written by you, Jonathan, and it contained a veiled threat, but you never sent it. You confided in your aunt, who agreed to keep it hidden. This, in itself, would have meant little, until another person learned of it. His gaze shifted to Miss Archer. She flinched but did not look away. You, Miss Archer, were Travers' secretary for nearly 6 years. You knew the contents of his confidential files, his financial dealings, his indiscretions. When you overheard Mrs. Kellaway and Jonathan discussing the letter, you realized its potential. Not to protect Jonathan, but to rid yourself of Travers. Her voice was sharp. That's absurd. I had no reason. Oh, but you did, Pinkerton said gently. Travers had promised you a sum from the sale of his London property. A promise he later withdrew. You were furious, and more importantly, you were desperate. I have spoken with your bank, your accounts were overdrawn. The letter, if found by the police after Travers' death, would direct suspicion onto Jonathan and away from you. A perfect smokescreen. Inspector Hall's eyes narrowed. Go on. Pinkerton paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. On the evening of Travers' death, you remained late at the office, claiming to organize the ledger. But the tea you brought him was laced with digitalis, stolen from the dispensary near your lodgings. You left him there, alone, the symptoms masked by his known heart condition. The next morning, he was found dead. Conveniently, the unsigned, unsent letter was in Jonathan's aunt's possession, ready to be discovered if the need arose. Miss Archer's lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders rigid. Pinkerton stopped before her. You underestimated one thing, my belief in the little details. The teaspoon on Travers' desk still bore a faint trace of powdered residue, too coarse to be sugar. And the handwriting on the envelope? It bore a second, faint impression beneath Jonathan's script, yours, from when you tested the ink flow on his pen earlier that day. A careless act, but it told me everything. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Miss Archer's voice broke it, brittle and cold. You can't prove it. On the contrary, Pinkerton said, his tone soft but unyielding. I already have. Inspector Hall. The inspector stepped forward. Miss Archer, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. Miss Archer's composure crumbled, her head sinking into her hands as Hall led her away. Jonathan exhaled deeply, his relief palpable. You believe me now, Mr. Pinkerton? Pinkerton allowed himself the faintest smile. My dear fellow, I never truly doubted you. But the truth must be drawn into the light at its own pace. It is the only way all can see it clearly. He retrieved his hat and cane, the fire's glow catching on the polished wood. As he stepped out into the crisp winter air, the first flakes of snow drifted down, muffling the sounds of the street. Another case concluded, not by brute force, but by the patient, methodical unraveling of lies.